They didn't fire him for making a mistake. They fired him for noticing one. They moved his desk to the basement. They told him to shred old documents. One of those documents cost them $85 million. This is not a story about revenge. It's about what happens when a system targets the wrong man. The first board meeting was just an introduction. I watched from the far side of the table. Simon Vale ran it with polished ease. He was the new chief operating officer. My title remained head of special projects. It was a title without a portfolio now. Simon had reassigned my teams the previous week. He mentioned it in a passing email. The email was copied to the CEO. It cited operational efficiency as the reason. My projects were distributed among his direct reports. No one objected. I was present, but not consulted. I simply acknowledged the email. I used the approved phrasing for such things. The realignment was presented as a strategic upgrade. My former direct reports now sent their updates to Simon. They copied me as a courtesy. The courtesy copies stopped after a few days. I did not inquire. My calendar cleared of all recurring meetings. New invites were not forthcoming. I spent my days in my office. I reviewed old project archives. I studied the company's bylaws. I read the minutes from past board meetings. These were documents few people ever accessed. The internal legal portal logged every view. No one checked those logs. I checked them daily. It was a quiet habit. The humiliation was not dramatic. It was administrative. My access badge failed to open the new executive wing one morning. Security politely redirected me. They said my profile needed an update. The update never came. I used the main elevator with everyone else. My parking spot was reassigned to a junior vice president. The email from facilities was apologetic. It blamed a system error. I parked in the visitor lot. I submitted receipts for reimbursement. Accounts payable questioned the receipts. They asked for a business purpose. I provided the facility's email chain. The reimbursements were approved after a delay. Simon called me into his office a month later. His space was modern and stark. He did not look up from his screen for a full minute. He finally gestured to a chair. He explained a new initiative. It was a vendor consolidation project. He needed someone to handle the grunt work. He said, I had a reputation for meticulous detail. He said the job was beneath my pay grade, but he needed it done right. I would report to a manager 3 levels down. That manager was my former subordinate. I accepted the assignment. I said I would review the vendor files immediately. Simon seemed almost disappointed by my calm. He dismissed me with a nod. The vendor project was a graveyard of old contracts. The company had grown through acquisition. Dozens of legacy agreements were never fully integrated. Some were 20 years old. They were stored in a physical archive. The digital records were incomplete. I requested access to the off-site storage facility. The request required Simon's approval. He approved it with a comment. He asked if this was the best use of my salary. I did not respond to the comment. I visited the storage unit the next day. It was a warehouse in an industrial park. The air was thick with dust. I found the boxes labeled with the old company names. I began with the smallest box. It was for a defunct logistics supplier. The paper smelled of mildew. Inside the box, file folders were neatly packed beneath the vendor contracts. I found a different set of documents. They were shareholder agreements. They were from the original founding of the parent company. They established the rules for board composition. They defined supermajority requirements. They outlined drag-along rights. These were not standard operating documents. These were the constitutional documents. I photographed each page. I returned the box to its exact location. I did not check out any documents. The warehouse log showed I had been there. It listed the box number. I reviewed. That was all. I drove back to the office. I worked on the vendor list for the rest of the day. I submitted a progress report by 5 p.m. A week later, the CEO announced a restructuring. The board had approved a new vision. Simon Vale would lead a key innovation committee. The committee would control all capital expenditure. This was a massive shift of power. The CFO appeared uneasy during the announcement. He did not speak after the meeting. I was asked to surrender my corporate credit card. It was part of the cost control measures. I handed it to the finance assistant. She processed the termination of my card. My expense account was also frozen. I would now need pre-approval for any expenditure. The pre-approval form required Simon's signature. I submitted a form for a professional membership fee. It was denied. The denial reason stated non-essential spending. I began to work from home more often. The vendor project required deep concentration. I told my new manager it was easier without office distractions. He agreed readily. He was happy to not see me. At home, I created a digital map. I connected the old shareholder agreements to the current corporate structure. I traced the lineage of voting rights. The company had gone through several investment rounds, but the original agreements had never been formally amended. They had been superseded by newer filings, or so everyone assumed. I cross-referenced dates and signatures. I noted a particular clause. It was about intellectual property assignment from founding employees. The language was unusually broad. It was also perpetual. It covered derivative works. I made a list of names. One name was the founder's son. He had left the company years ago after a dispute. He was a quiet man living abroad. He owned a small consulting firm now. I found his professional email address. I drafted a message. It was not about the company. It was a technical question about an old software framework. I used my personal email account. He replied 2 days later. He was helpful. We exchanged a few more emails. I never identified my employer. He mentioned his father in passing. He said the old man was still bitter about how things ended. He said certain promises were never kept. Those promises were not financial. They were about stewardship. I did not ask for details. I thanked him for his technical insight. I let the correspondence fade. I had established a channel. That was all I needed for now. Meanwhile, Simon's committee began its work. They canceled several long-running projects. They announced a new partnership with a flashy tech startup. The startup was owned by Simon's brother-in-law. This fact was buried in the disclosure appendix. Few people read it. The partnership required a significant upfront investment. The board approved it based on Simon's presentation. The CFO abstained from the vote. The meeting minutes recorded the abstention without comment. I read the minutes when they were distributed. I filed them in my personal archive. A month passed. My performance review was conducted by my new manager. He gave me a satisfactory rating. He noted I was thorough but lacked strategic impact. He recommended I focus on finishing the vendor project. I acknowledged the feedback. I asked no questions. That same week, Simon's Innovation Committee held an all-hands meeting. It was to celebrate the new partnership. They served expensive coffee and pastries. I was not on the invite list. I watched from my office window as the catering staff set up in the atrium. I went back to my screen. I was reviewing the company's insurance policies. The directors' and officers' liability coverage was up for renewal. The policy had a standard exclusion section. One exclusion was for fraudulent acts. Another was for personal profit. The definitions were very specific. I noted the policy number and the renewal date. It was 90 days away. Later that afternoon, I received a calendar invite. It was from the CEO's executive assistant. The subject was forward planning discussion. It was for a one-on-one meeting. It was scheduled for 2 weeks out. The location was the CEO's office. There was no agenda attached. I accepted the invite. I did not ask for context. I knew what it was about. My role was now redundant. The vendor project was my last task. They would offer me a severance package. They would ask for my resignation. It was the standard procedure. I had seen it happen to others. I began to prepare my own documents. Instead, I compiled a neutral summary of my findings from the vendor project. I highlighted several legacy contracts with auto-renewal clauses. The clauses triggered significant fee increases. The dates for notification were approaching. I sent this summary to my manager and Simon Vale. I did not highlight the urgency. I simply presented the data. Simon replied quickly. He told me to handle the terminations immediately. He said to avoid any unnecessary costs. He copied the CFO. This was my instruction. I now had written authority to act on these specific contracts. My access to the contract management system was reinstated for this purpose. I acknowledged his email. I began the termination process for the first vendor. It was a standard procedure. It required a 30-day written notice. The notice had to be sent by certified mail. I processed the request. I filed the confirmation in the system. Then I moved to the second contract. This one was different. It was not a vendor agreement. It was a licensing deal for a core software component. The counterparty was a small firm I recognized from my research. It was the founder's son's consulting company. The license was paid annually. The fee was nominal. The auto-renewal clause was there, but the termination language was not standard. It required a board resolution to cancel. This fact was in subsection D, paragraph 4. I generated a report showing this clause. I sent it to Simon. I asked for guidance. I said, a board resolution would be needed to terminate. He replied within the hour. He said not to bother the board with trivialities. He told me to find another way. He said to just stop the payment. That would void the agreement. He gave me a direct order. I archived his email in a secure folder. I did not stop the payment. I let the invoice proceed for approval. It was for $480. The system approved it automatically. The payment would be sent in the next cycle. My meeting with the CEO was tomorrow. My office was already being cleared. I had taken my personal items home over the previous weeks. There was nothing left but the company laptop. I would return it after the meeting. I reviewed my final document one last time. It was not a presentation. It was a simple timeline. It linked events to contractual obligations. It was written in plain language. It would not be shown today. Today was for listening. The severance offer would be made. I would ask for time to review it. They would give me 48 hours. That was the company policy. I closed my laptop. The sun was setting. The building was quiet. The Innovation Committee was at a dinner celebrating their new partnership. I could see the empty atrium from my window. The trash cans were full of the fancy pastry wrappers. The cleaning staff was beginning their work. The CEO's office was all glass and white oak. He gestured for me to sit. He did not smile. He called me by my first name. He said the company was moving in a new direction. He thanked me for my years of service. He said my role had been eliminated. He slid a folder across the table. It contained the severance agreement. The terms were standard. 6 months of salary, continued health benefits for that period, a non-disparagement clause, a full release of all claims against the company. He emphasized the release. He said it was a generous package. He said I should take time to consider it. But he needed an answer by the end of the week. I took the folder. I said I would review it with my advisor. He nodded. He assumed I meant a lawyer. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. I did not contact a lawyer. I went to the public library instead. I used their computers to access the state corporate registry. I pulled the current articles of incorporation for the company. I compared them to the original bylaws from the warehouse. There was a discrepancy in the quorum requirements. The new articles stated a simple majority of directors. The old bylaws required a majority of FATE seats. FAE, not just present members. 2 board seats were currently vacant. This detail changed the math for recent votes. I printed the documents at the library I paid with coins. I did not save anything to a cloud drive back at my apartment. I organized my files. I created a timeline on a physical whiteboard. I used index cards and string. It was an old-fashioned method. It left no digital trace. The timeline showed key decisions: the partnership approval, the capital expenditure committee formation, the CFO's abstention. I connected these to the quorum issue. I also noted the insurance renewal date. It was now 87 days away. I took a photo of the whiteboard with a film camera. I developed the film at a local shop. I stored the print in a safety deposit box. I paid for the box with cash for 1 year. The next day, I returned to the office to collect my final check. My badge still opened the main door. I went to the finance department. The clerk handed me an envelope. She said my final paycheck and the severance agreement were inside. She said I needed to sign the agreement to receive the severance funds. I thanked her. I walked through the nearly empty office. It was a holiday for most staff. I saw Simon Vale in his office with 2 men in suits. They were not company employees. They looked like bankers. They were laughing. I passed by without looking in. At home, I read the severance agreement carefully. The release language was extremely broad. It would prevent me from bringing any legal action. It would also prevent me from cooperating with any government investigation. I set the document aside. I did not sign it. I emailed the CEO. I used my personal email. I stated I needed clarification on one clause. I asked if the release applied to obligations I might have as a shareholder. I was a minor shareholder from an old employee stock plan. I owned a few hundred shares. The CEO forwarded my email to the general counsel. The general counsel called me. He was polite but firm. He said the release covered all claims in any capacity. He asked why I was asking. I said I was being thorough. I said I would respond soon. He warned me that the offer was conditional on a swift signature. The implied threat was clear. I let the deadline approach. On the final day, I sent a brief email. I declined the severance offer. I stated I preferred to retain my rights as a shareholder. I thanked them for the opportunity. The general counsel replied immediately. He said this was a mistake. He said the company would now contest any unemployment benefits. He said my refusal would be noted. I did not respond. An hour later, my company email account was deactivated. My access to all systems was revoked. I was officially terminated. The formal letter arrived by courier the next morning. It cited role elimination as the cause. It wished me well in my future endeavors. A week later, I received a notice from the state unemployment office. The company had contested my claim. They stated I had refused suitable employment. The hearing was scheduled for a month out. I gathered my documentation. I had copies of the severance agreement. I had the email where I was told to report to a manager 3 levels down. I had the performance review noting my lack of strategic impact. This was all routine. I would represent myself at the hearing. It was a procedural delay tactic. The company's lawyer would be there. It would cost them more in legal fees than the unemployment payments. That was not my concern. My goal was to appear in the official hearing record. I needed a legal proceeding to reference later. The hearing was held in a small government office. The company's external counsel attended via phone. He argued I had been insubordinate. He cited my refusal of the severance package as evidence of bad faith. The hearing officer asked for specifics of insubordination. The lawyer could not provide any. He fell back on the role elimination. The hearing officer approved my unemployment claim. The entire process took 20 minutes. The official order was entered into the record. I requested a certified copy. I paid a small fee. I now had a document stating my termination was due to a bona fide elimination of position. It contradicted any future claim of performance issues. During this period, I monitored the company's public filings. The partnership with Simon's brother-in-law's startup was announced in a press release. The financial terms were not disclosed. The release touted revolutionary technology. Industry blogs were skeptical. They pointed out the startup had no published patents. I knew from the vendor files that our company's core IP was built on licensed code. The license was from that small consulting firm, the one owned by the founder's son, the one with the $480 annual fee. The payment had gone through. The license remained active. No one had checked the underlying terms. The terms stated that any derivative product using the licensed code remained subject to the agreement. The new partnership intended to create a derivative product. This fact was in the partnership's technical appendix. I had a copy from the board materials portal before my access was cut. I began to write a formal letter. It was not addressed to the company. It was addressed to the founder's son. I used his consulting firm address. I identified myself as a former employee. I stated I had come across the licensing agreement during my work. I noted the upcoming development project. I attached the technical appendix showing the planned derivative use. I asked for his confirmation of the license's applicability. I sent the letter by international registered mail. I included a prepaid return envelope. I did not make any suggestions. I only asked for clarifications. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. It was brief and professional. He confirmed the license would apply. He cited the specific clause. He thanked me for bringing the matter to his attention. He said he would be in touch with the company's licensing department. This was the trigger. He would now contact the company. The first point of contact would be the legal department. They would have no record of this obscure agreement. They would search the system. They would find the invoice payment. They would then find Simon Vale's email. The email where he ordered me to stop the payment? They would see the payment was not stopped. They would ask why. They would pull the contract. They would read the clause requiring a board resolution. They would see no such resolution existed. This was a compliance failure. It was a small one, but it would start an audit trail. The legal department would have to inform the general counsel. The general counsel would have to inform the CFO. The CFO had abstained from the partnership vote. He would now have a reason to ask hard questions. I waited. I did nothing. I took a temporary job at a bookstore. It was quiet work. I shelved novels and sorted magazines. I did not think about the company. I focused on the physical task of organizing books. It was a mental reset. Weeks passed. Then a former colleague reached out via LinkedIn. He asked if we could meet for coffee. He said he was curious about my sudden departure. I agreed to meet. He was nervous. He worked in the finance department now. He said there was an internal audit happening. It was focused on procurement and vendor contracts. Simon Vale was reportedly furious. The audit was requested by the CFO. The board had approved it as a routine check. But the scope was unusually narrow. It was looking at contracts under a certain value. The threshold was $500. My former colleague did not know why. He thought I might know something. I said I did not. I wished him well. He left disappointed. The audit would uncover more than the one license. It would find the other legacy contracts. The ones with auto-renewal clauses I had already terminated, but it would also find anomalies. It would find contracts signed by managers who no longer worked there. It would find missing signatures. It would find a pattern of administrative neglect. This neglect was the foundation of Simon's efficiency. He had streamlined processes by ignoring governance. The audit report would be a dry list of findings. Each finding would require a remediation plan. The plans would require board oversight. Simon's committee would now be under a microscope. His authority was based on speed and decisiveness. Scrutiny was his enemy. I received another letter. This one was from the company's external law firm. It was addressed to me at my home. It stated they were representing the company in a confidential matter. They believed I might possess documents relevant to a licensing issue. They asked me to preserve all such documents. They reminded me of my ongoing confidentiality obligations. They did not mention a lawsuit. They did not threaten. The language was careful and neutral. I wrote a one-sentence reply. I acknowledged receipt of their letter. I did not confirm or deny possessing any documents. I mailed it back. The exchange was now part of the legal record. They knew I was not intimidated. They also knew I was not volunteering anything. This would force them to decide whether to escalate. Escalation would mean a subpoena. A subpoena would bring everything into a discovery process. That would expose the board to depositions. They would want to avoid that. The pressure was now on them to contain the issue internally. He had given the order to ignore the contract. He had done it over email. He had copied the CFO. The CFO now had a weapon. The founder's son would be getting impatient. The company's legal team would have contacted him. They would likely offer a quick settlement. They would propose a one-time buyout of the license. He would refuse. He had no need for a large sum. He had principal. His father's legacy was tied to that code. He would demand compliance with the original terms. The terms gave him audit rights. He could request a review of the derivative product. That review would delay the partnership's launch. The startup needed the launch to secure its next funding round. The timelines were now intersecting. Simon had promised the board a prototype in 90 days. The audit rights could stall it for months. The board would start asking about the delay. Simon would have to explain. He could not explain without revealing the licensing oversight. His credibility would crack. I sat in my small apartment. The whiteboard timeline was still on the wall. I added a new index card. It read legal preservation letter received. I drew a line to the insurance renewal date. The directors and officers' policy would soon be up for renewal. The underwriters would conduct their due diligence. They would ask if there were any pending legal matters. The general counsel would have to disclose the licensing dispute. He would have to disclose the internal audit. The insurance premiums would increase. The board would see the cost of neglect. They would ask who was responsible. The audit findings would point to a lack of controls in Simon's domain. He would blame a departed employee. He would blame me. But he had no evidence of my malfeasance. Only evidence of my follow-up emails asking for guidance. My trail was clean. His was not. My phone vibrated. It was a calendar alert. It was not for a meeting. It was a personal reminder. The reminder said simply, Policy Renewal for the Initial Underwriter Questions. The date was 2 weeks away. I had no role in the process, but I knew the sequence. The CFO would receive the questionnaire. He would forward it to legal. Legal would draft the disclosures. The disclosures would be reviewed by the audit committee. The audit committee was chaired by a board member who had always been skeptical of Simon. She was a former regulator. She appreciated orderly processes. She would read the dry audit findings about $500 contracts. She would connect them to the $1 million partnership. She would not like the connection. Her questions would be precise. They would be asked in a closed session. Simon would not be present to defend himself. His fate would be decided in a room he could not enter. I turned off the calendar alert. I made a cup of tea. The evening was quiet. The chain of consequences was now in motion. It no longer required my attention. It would follow the company's own protocols. Those protocols were designed to protect the institution. They would now consume the individual who had bypassed them. I turned out the light. The whiteboard glowed faintly in the dark. The underwriter's questionnaire arrived at the company on schedule. It was a standard form. Section 7 asked about pending litigation or disputes. The General Counsel's office drafted a response. They listed 3 minor vendor disputes. They did not list the licensing issue. They considered it an operational matter. The form was signed by the CFO and returned. This was a routine filing. No one thought much of it. A junior lawyer in the General Counsel's office was uneasy. She had been tasked with researching the old license. She found the founder's son's latest communication. It was a formal notice of audit rights. He intended to exercise them. This constituted a dispute. She flagged it for her superior. Her superior told her to note it in an internal memo, but he said it was too late to amend the insurance filing. The risk was low, he said. The memo was filed in the internal legal database. Its access log was automatically recorded. The audit committee met the following week. The agenda included the internal audit findings. The findings were presented by the head of internal audit. He was a cautious man. He presented a slide deck. Slide 12 focused on procurement non-compliance. It listed several contract management failures. The amounts were small. The committee chair, the former regulator, asked a quiet question. She asked if these failures were isolated to low-value contracts. The auditor said his team had followed the approved scope. He could not speak to higher-value agreements. The chair asked for the scope to be expanded. She wanted a review of all contracts linked to the new Innovation Committee's projects. The other committee members agreed. It was a logical step. The directive was recorded in the minutes. A copy of the minutes was distributed to the board. Simon Vale was copied on the distribution as Kuwo. He would have read the directive that evening. He would have seen the expansion of the audit aimed at his domain. Simon reacted predictably. He scheduled a meeting with the head of internal audit. He demanded to understand the rationale. The auditor cited the committee's directive. Simon argued it was a waste of resources. He said it would delay critical projects. The auditor remained professional. He said his team was obligated to follow the committee's instructions. Simon ended the meeting abruptly. He then emailed the CFO. He questioned the need for an expanded audit. He cited cost concerns. The CFO's reply was neutral. He said the audit committee had independent authority. He said the CFO office would support their work. This was a subtle shift. The CFO was no longer aligning with Simon. Simon forwarded the email chain to the CEO. He expressed frustration. He said the audit was a distraction from growth. The CEO replied with a single line. He said the committee had the right to oversee risk. The tone was dismissive. Simon's influence was fraying. Meanwhile, the founder's son engaged a law firm. The firm sent a formal letter to the company. It cited the audit rights clause. It requested access to development servers for a preliminary review. The letter gave a 10-day deadline. The legal department panicked. Granting access would expose the derivative product. Denying access would be a breach of contract. They convened a crisis meeting. Simon was invited. He was furious. He said the license was trivial. He said the company should just buy the man out. The General Counsel explained the problem. The founder's son was not interested in money. He was interested in compliance. He wanted to ensure the derivative product did not violate the license ethical use provisions. Those provisions were vague. They prohibited use in certain industries. The new partnership was targeting one of those industries. This fact had been overlooked. The legal team needed to find the original negotiation history. They searched the physical archive again. They found the box I had reviewed months before. They found the shareholder agreements, but they could not find any correspondence about the license's ethical clauses. The record was empty. They assumed the clauses were boilerplate. They advised the company to deny the audit request. They would argue it was overly broad. This would trigger a lawsuit. But a lawsuit would take years. It would be a delaying tactic. The general counsel recommended this path to the CEO. The CEO approved it. A denial letter was drafted. It was sent 2 days before the deadline. The founder's son's law firm filed a motion for injunctive relief in state court the next day. The matter was now a legal proceeding. The court filing was public. A legal news service picked it up. They wrote a short piece about a legacy tech founder challenging a major corporation. The story was niche, but it was noticed. An analyst at a major investment firm read it. He was researching the company's partnership with the startup. He grew curious. He requested a copy of the lawsuit. He read the complaint. He saw the mention of ethical use provisions. He connected it to the partnership's stated market. He wrote an email to his portfolio manager. He suggested a deeper look at the company's IP liabilities. The portfolio manager forwarded the email to the research department. This was a tiny ripple. But in the world of institutional investors, ripples are tracked. The expanded audit began. The internal audit team requested all contracts for the Innovation Committee's projects. Simon's staff was slow to respond. They cited confidentiality. The audit team escalated to the audit committee chair. She sent a direct email to the CEO. She cited the board's authority. She said obstruction would be noted in her report. The CEO forwarded her email to Simon. He told Simon to comply fully. Simon's team released the documents. Among them was the partnership agreement with his brother-in-law's startup. The audit team reviewed it. They flagged the disclosure about the brother-in-law's ownership. They calculated the upfront investment. They compared it to the startup's valuation. The valuation was based on a previous funding round. That round had been led by a venture capital firm. One of the venture capital firm's partners sat on the company's board. This was a conflict of interest that had not been formally recused. The audit team wrote a finding. It was labeled Conflict of Interest Due by T-Twine Potential. They attached the relevant documents. They included the board minutes from the partnership approval vote. The minutes showed the venture capitalist board member had voted in favor. He had not disclosed his firm's prior investment. The finding was added to the draft audit report. The draft report was circulated to the audit committee. The chair read it carefully. She scheduled a special meeting. She invited only independent board members. The CEO was not invited. Simon was not invited. The venture capitalist board member was not invited. They met via secure video conference. The chair presented the findings. She focused on the conflict of interest and the licensing lawsuit. She connected them. She argued that the board had not been fully informed. She proposed a resolution. The resolution called for an independent review of the partnership's approval process. The independent review would be conducted by an outside law firm. The board voted. The resolution passed. The outside law firm was engaged the next day. Their mandate was broad. They were to examine the partnership's due diligence, the licensing risks, and the conflict of interest. They were given access to all communications, including emails. The law firm's data request was massive. It captured Simon Vale's email account. It captured his communications with his brother-in-law. It captured his instructions to me about the vendor contracts. It captured his order to stop the license payment. It captured his complaints about the audit. The law firm's junior associates began sifting through the material. They used keyword searches. One search was for the license number. That search pulled up my email to Simon asking for guidance on the board resolution. It pulled up his reply telling me to just stop the payment. It pulled up the subsequent invoice approval. It showed the payment was made. The associate wrote a memo. She outlined a potential breach of fiduciary duty. She noted that Akuo had knowingly bypassed a contractual safeguard to avoid board oversight. Her senior reviewed it. He elevated it to the lead partner. The lead partner knew this was serious, but his job was to deliver facts, not conclusions. He included the memo in his weekly update to the audit committee chair. The chair received the update on a Friday afternoon. She read the memo twice. She saw the pattern. She saw the negligence. She also saw the attempt to cover it up by not disclosing the lawsuit to the insurers. She had a decision to make. She could bring it to the full board immediately, or she could let the investigation run its course. She chose the latter. She instructed the law firm to deepen its review of all contracts Simon had authorized in the last 18 months. She wanted a full picture. The law firm's fees began to accumulate. The cost was billed to the company's legal budget. The CFO saw the mounting invoices. He asked the CEO for an explanation. The CEO said it was a board-mandated review. The CFO updated his financial forecasts. He added a line item for special investigations. The amount was significant enough to affect quarterly earnings guidance. The company's investor relations team prepared for the quarterly earnings call. They drafted the script. They included a vague mention of higher legal and professional fees. They attributed it to growth initiatives. The CFO reviewed the script. He insisted on more transparency. He argued that analysts would ask anyway. The CEO overruled him. The call proceeded as scripted. An analyst from the firm that had seen the lawsuit did ask. He inquired about the pending litigation mentioned in the court filings. The CEO was caught off guard. He said it was a minor dispute. He said the company's position was strong. His voice lacked conviction. The analyst asked a follow-up. He asked if the dispute impacted the timeline for the new partnership. The CEO said there was no impact. This was a mistake. The founder's son's law firm issued a press release the next day. It stated that the court had granted an expedited hearing on the injunction. The hearing was set for 30 days out. The press release quoted the ethical use provisions. It was picked up by a major business news outlet. The headline read, "Legacy founder throws wrench into tech giant's new venture." The stock price dipped 3%. It was not a crash, but it was a signal. The board's independent members convened an emergency call. The audit committee chair presented the facts she had. She showed the email chain about the license. She showed the conflict of interest finding. She did not offer an opinion. She simply presented the documents. The board voted to place Simon Vale on a leave of absence. The reason given was to allow for a full and unimpeded investigation. The press release was carefully worded. It said he was stepping aside temporarily to focus on personal matters. The market interpreted this correctly. The stock dropped another 5%. Simon cleaned out his desk. He was escorted from the building. He did not look at anyone. His departure was quiet and swift. The CEO appointed an interim Kuo from the finance department. It was a safe choice. The interim Kuo's first task was to assess the licensing lawsuit. His second task was to review the partnership's viability. His third task was to control costs. The outside law firm continued its work. Their focus now shifted from Simon to the broader approval chain. They looked at the board's diligence. They interviewed the venture capitalist board member. He was defensive. He said his firm's investment was minor. He said he had no material interest. The lawyers pressed him on the definition of material. The discussion became tense. The board member resigned from the board the following week. He cited time commitments. The company accepted his resignation without comment. Another news item appeared. This one connected the dots between the resigned board member, his venture firm, and the startup. The narrative of insider dealing began to take shape. It was not yet a scandal. It was a cloud. I read about Simon's leave of absence online. I was at the bookstore. I was unpacking a shipment of new titles. My phone showed the notification. I read the article. I put my phone away. I finished stacking the books. The process was mechanical. There was no satisfaction. It was simply a new state of facts. The sequence was advancing. The next pressure point was the court hearing. The injunction hearing would force the company to disclose its development plans. It would also expose the ethical use provisions to a judge. The judge would ask whether the company had performed due diligence. The company would have to admit it had not. Its defense would be weak. It would likely seek a settlement. But the founder's son now held more leverage. He could demand a board seat. He could demand a change in the partnership's direction. His goals were unclear. That uncertainty was the greatest risk. The interim coup reached out to the founder's son's lawyers. He proposed a meeting. The lawyers agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the day before the court hearing. It was a tactical move. It showed desperation. The founder's son attended via video. He listened as the company's lawyers offered a generous licensing buyout. He declined. He said his interest was not financial. He said he wanted the derivative product to be used ethically, as his father intended. He proposed a governance solution. He wanted a 3-person committee to oversee the product's use. The committee would include a representative from his father's foundation. The company's lawyers balked. They said it was an operational intrusion. The founder's son ended the meeting. He said he would see them in court. The company's position was now untenable. They would either lose in court and face an injunction, or they would have to abandon the partnership. Both outcomes were costly. The CEO called a full board meeting. The agenda was to decide on a settlement strategy. The board was divided. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to settle quickly. The debate was heated. The audit committee chair remained silent for most of it. Then she spoke. She asked a simple question. She asked who had authorized the partnership without a full IP review. The room went quiet. The CEO said the Innovation Committee had approved it. The chair asked for the committee's meeting minutes. The minutes showed Simon Vale had presented the recommendation. The committee had voted to approve based on his presentation. The chair asked if any member had asked about IP risks. The minutes showed no such discussion. The chair said this was a failure of governance. She said the board now had 2 liabilities, a bad partnership and a lawsuit. She recommended the board terminate the partnership agreement. She cited the material adverse change clause. The company could invoke it based on the litigation. The startup would sue, but the damages would be limited. It was the least bad option. The board voted. The motion passed. The partnership was terminated. The company issued a press release citing strategic realignment. The startup's founder, Simon's brother-in-law, gave an angry interview. He accused the company of bad faith. He hinted at undisclosed problems. The cloud darkened. Simon Vale, on leave, was now associated with a failed partnership and a resigned board member. His professional reputation was crumbling. The company had to decide his official status. The outside law firm delivered its final report. It was hundreds of pages long. Its executive summary contained 3 key points. First, there was a pattern of bypassing contract controls. Second, there was a failure to disclose a material conflict of interest. Third, there was negligence in managing IP risk. The report did not recommend criminal action. It stated these were governance failures. The board used the report to justify terminating Simon for cause. This meant he would receive no severance. His stock options would be forfeited. The termination letter was sent by courier. He had 30 days to contest it. He hired a lawyer. His lawyer sent a threatening letter. He claimed the termination was retaliatory. He demanded a generous exit package. The company's general counsel saw the threat as a bluff. He knew Simon would not want his emails entered into evidence in a wrongful termination suit. The company called his bluff. They refused to negotiate. Simon's lawyer went quiet. The court hearing proceeded. With the partnership terminated, the injunction request was moot. The judge dismissed the case but awarded legal fees to the founder's son. The fee award was a public rebuke. It stated the company had acted unreasonably. The company paid the fees. The matter was closed. But the founder's son was not finished. He wrote an open letter to the company's board. He published it on a professional blog. He outlined the ethical principles his father had embedded in the code. He said the company had lost its way. He urged the board to reconsider its culture. The letter was heartfelt and damning. It was shared widely within the tech industry. It became a case study in poor IP stewardship. The company's brand was tarnished among the engineering talent it needed to hire. Recruitment became harder. The quarterly earnings came in below guidance. The CFO cited higher legal costs and partnership termination fees. The stock price settled at a lower plateau. The board formed a new governance committee. They rewrote the contract approval policies. They installed new controls. The interim Kako was made permanent. He was a bland process. Oriented man, the company's growth slowed. It became more cautious. This was the natural consequence. The institution had protected itself by sacrificing the individual who disregarded its rules. The process was complete. I closed my whiteboard timeline. I took down the index cards and strings. I put them in a cardboard box. I placed the box in my closet. I had no further use for it. My time at the bookstore was ending. It was with a small firm that specialized in corporate governance. The work would be dull and precise. It would suit me. I received a phone call. It was from a headhunter. She said a former colleague had recommended me. She said the company was looking for someone with a deep understanding of legacy systems and contract compliance. I told her I was available for an interview. The consulting firm's office was in a modest building downtown. The interview was with a senior partner named Martin. His questions were specific. He asked about archival research methods. He asked how to trace contractual obligations through corporate acquisitions. I gave concise answers. I did not mention my former employer. Martin seemed satisfied. He offered me a contract position. It was for a 6-month project. The client was a mid-sized manufacturing company. They were preparing for a private equity audit. My role would be to review their supplier agreements for hidden liabilities. I accepted. I started the following Monday. My new routine was quiet. I took the bus to the client's site. I was given a small, windowless office near their records department. My task was methodical. I read contracts and flagged anomalies. I produced daily reports. They were dry and factual. The client's legal team appreciated my work. They said I was thorough. I did not socialize. I ate lunch at my desk. I left at 5 p.m. This went on for months. I was anonymous again. It was comfortable. Meanwhile, my former company continued its slow decline. The news trickled out in trade publications. The permanent Kuo initiated a broad cost-cutting program. He called it a strategic review. It included layoffs. The first wave targeted the Innovation Committee's staff. They were let go with minimal severance. Morale plummeted. Several key engineers resigned. They joined competitors. The company's product roadmap stalled. The board grew restless. The CEO's position became insecure. The audit committee chair gained influence. She pushed for a deeper cultural overhaul. She advocated for an external review of the entire executive team. The board approved it reluctantly. Another outside firm was hired. This one specialized in organizational effectiveness. They interviewed dozens of employees. They asked about decision-making processes. They asked about tone at the top. The report, when delivered, was brutally honest. It described a culture of fear and shortcuts. It cited the recent partnership fiasco as a symptom. It recommended significant leadership changes. The board scheduled a retreat to discuss the findings. Simon Vale's lawyer finally made a move. He filed a wrongful termination lawsuit. The suit claimed defamation and breach of implied contract. It was a long shot, but it forced the company to engage. The lawsuit included a discovery request. It demanded all internal communications about Simon for the past 2 years. The company's legal team had to compile the documents. This process pulled the law firm's earlier report back into the light. The report's findings about contract bypasses were now part of a public court filing. A reporter subpoenaed the filing. She wrote a detailed article. It connected the dots between the failed partnership, the licensing lawsuit, and Simon's termination. The article quoted the report's phrase, pattern of bypassing contract controls. It did not mention me. I was a footnote in the email chain. That was all. The article triggered a new problem. The company's directors' and officers' liability insurance was up for renewal. The underwriters had been monitoring the situation. They received the latest packet of disclosures. This time, the general counsel included the wrongful termination lawsuit and the organizational report. The underwriters balked. They sent a letter. They stated the premium would triple. They also added a new exclusion. The exclusion was for claims arising from improper governance procedures. The board was furious. The cost was significant. The exclusion was worse. It left the board members personally exposed. They demanded the CEO find a solution. The CEO had no solution. The audit committee chair suggested they form a special litigation committee. This committee would investigate the claims in Simon's lawsuit. Its goal would be to settle quickly and quietly. The board agreed. The special committee was formed. It hired yet another law firm. This firm began negotiating with Simon's lawyer. The negotiations were tense. Simon wanted his full severance package reinstated. He also wanted a public statement clearing his name. The company refused the statement. They offered money. The back and forth lasted weeks. During this time, the company's quarterly results were released. They missed expectations again. The stock hit a new low. Activist investors began to accumulate shares. A fund called Grey Rock Capital filed a 13D. They announced they intended to seek board representation. They cited chronic underperformance and governance failures. The board was now under siege from multiple directions. My consulting project ended. Martin asked to see me. He said, the client was very pleased. He offered me a full-time position. I accepted. My title would be Senior Compliance Specialist. The work was similar, but with more responsibility. I would now lead small teams on audits. My first assignment was internal. Martin wanted me to review our own firm's client engagement contracts. He wanted to ensure we had no hidden exposures. I started the review immediately. It was familiar work. At my former company, the activist campaign intensified. Grey Rock Capital nominated 2 directors for election at the upcoming annual meeting. They were a former telecom CEO and a corporate governance professor. Their proxy statement highlighted the licensing lawsuit and the insurance premium hike. They argued the board had failed in its oversight duty. The board prepared for a proxy fight. They hired a famous proxy solicitation firm. The cost was enormous. The battle would be decided by the large institutional shareholders. Those shareholders received presentations from both sides. The presentations were filled with charts and graphs. The company's presentation emphasized stability and a new path forward. The activists' presentation emphasized past failures. They used the law firm's report as evidence. The institutional shareholders were notoriously risk-averse. They disliked public fights. They pressured the board to reach a settlement with the activists. The board entered negotiations with Grey Rock. The negotiations resulted in a deal. The company would add one of Grey Rock's nominees to the board immediately. The other would stand for election at the annual meeting. In return, Grey Rock would suspend its public campaign. The board member added immediately was the corporate governance professor. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Vance. She joined the audit committee. Her first action was to request a full briefing on all ongoing litigation. The briefing included Simon's lawsuit. She read the underlying documents. She focused on the email chain about the license. She asked who the other participant was. She was given my name. She asked if I had been interviewed during the earlier investigation. The general counsel said I had not. Dr. Vance found that odd. She asked for my contact information. The general counsel said they did not have current details. He said I had declined severance and left. Dr. Vance made a note. She did not pursue it further at that time. But the question was now in the record. The annual shareholder meeting was a subdued affair. It was held virtually. The CEO gave a scripted speech. He acknowledged past challenges. He outlined a plan for operational rigor. Shareholders voted. Both activist nominees were elected. The board now had 2 new independent voices. He acknowledged Pant. The change was subtle but significant. The old guard's control was weakened. The audit committee chair, now allied with Dr. Vance, proposed a new policy. She suggested the board review the performance of the general counsel. She argued that the legal department's failures had contributed to the crisis. The board agreed to the review. The general counsel was placed under scrutiny. He began to update his resume. Simon's lawsuit reached a settlement. The special litigation committee authorized a payment. It was less than his full severance, but substantial. The agreement included a strict confidentiality clause. Simon disappeared from the industry news. His career was effectively over. The company recorded the settlement as a one-time charge. It impacted earnings yet again. The cycle of bad news seemed unbreakable. Dr. Eleanor Vance continued her quiet review. She asked the internal audit department for their full archive on the vendor consolidation project. She wanted to see my original reports. The reports were retrieved. They were models of clarity. They listed the problematic contracts. They highlighted the license agreement. They included my note about the board resolution requirement. Dr. Vance compared these to the later law firm's report. She saw the consistency. She also saw that my work had been correct. She wondered why I had been terminated. She asked the head of HR for my personnel file. The file contained my performance review citing lack of strategic impact. It contained the email reassigning my teams. It contained no disciplinary actions. Dr. Vance saw the contradiction. A competent employee identifying a major risk was removed. She did not voice her suspicion. She filed the documents away. She now had a complete picture. My new life was orderly. I led a team of 3 junior consultants. We worked on a project for a financial services client. We were reviewing their outsourcing agreements. One afternoon, my cell phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I let it go to voicemail. The caller did not leave a message. An hour later, my work phone rang. It was Martin. He said someone had called the main office asking for me. They would not give a name. They said it was a personal matter. Martin gave me the callback number. I recognized the area code. It was from the city where my former company was headquartered. I did not return the call. I assumed it was a recruiter or a lawyer. I had no interest in either. The caller tried again the next day. This time, they left a voicemail on my cell. The voice was female, professional, and calm. She said her name was Eleanor Vance. She said she was a board member of my former employer. She said she was conducting a historical review of certain projects. She would appreciate 10 minutes of my time. She left a direct phone number. I listened to the message twice. I deleted it. I did not call back. She was not a threat. She was an auditor. Her review would follow its own course. My input was irrelevant. The facts were already in the documents she possessed. A week later, a letter arrived at my apartment. It was from Dr. Vance. It was written on plain paper, not company letterhead. It was brief. It stated she was examining the company's risk management processes. She believed my work on the vendor project was a useful case study. She asked if I would be willing to answer a few factual questions by email. She promised confidentiality. She provided a secure email address. I considered the request. There was no legal obligation to respond, but there was also no risk. I could control the narrative by saying very little. I drafted a reply. I stated that my work was documented in the reports. I said I had no additional information beyond what was already in the company's records. I wished her well in her review. I sent the email. She replied with a thank you. She asked one follow-up question. She asked if I had ever been instructed to disregard a contractual clause. I replied with a single sentence. I said I had always followed approved company procedures. That was the end of the correspondence. Dr. Vance's review concluded. She prepared a memo for the board's governance committee. The memo did not recommend any action regarding me. It focused on systemic issues. It recommended that the company institute a whistleblower policy with better protections. It recommended that legal and compliance have a direct reporting line to the audit committee. It recommended mandatory training for all officers on contract governance. The board adopted the recommendations. They were announced in a press release about governance enhancements. The market did not react. It was a non-event. Time passed. My former company continued to shrink. It sold off a non-core division. It used the proceeds to pay down debt. The stock price stabilized at a lower level. It became a stable, boring company. The era of aggressive growth was over. The CEO resigned unexpectedly. He cited family reasons. The board appointed the permanent COO as interim CEO. A search for a permanent CEO began. The headhunters targeted steady, conservative candidates. The company's story was no longer about disruption. It was about survival and modest returns. My consulting work remained engaging. I was promoted to manager. I had a team of 5. We traveled to client sites occasionally. I enjoyed the structure of audits. I liked finding gaps and recommending fixes. The work had a clear beginning and end. There was no ambiguity. One evening, I was packing for a business trip. I turned on the television for background noise. A financial news channel was on. They were discussing mergers and acquisitions. A ticker at the bottom of the screen showed my former company's stock symbol. It was flashing. I turned up the volume. The anchor reported that the company had received a buyout offer. The offer was from a larger competitor. The price was at a modest premium to the current share price. The board was reportedly considering the offer. I stood still for a moment. Then I continued packing my suitcase. I folded my shirts neatly. I placed my toiletries in a clear bag. The news continued. Analysts speculated that the acquirer wanted the company's customer base, not its technology. They said the deal would likely pass regulatory scrutiny. It would close in 6 to 9 months. I zipped up my suitcase. I turned off the television. The room was silent. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. My expression was empty. The process was complete. The company that had erased me was now itself being erased. It was a neutral outcome, a transaction. I picked up my suitcase and coat. I left for the airport. The cab ride was quiet. The city lights blurred past the window. I did not think about the past. I thought about the next day's agenda. The audit would begin at 9 a.m. I needed to be rested.